Welcome, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. Thank you very much for coming to our Fireside Chat today. I'm the co-owner and managing director with Impetus Digital. Impetus Digital has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous collaboration tools for life science companies to be able to connect with their customers, to be able to do things like advisory boards, investigator meetings, protocol development, MVP development, and a whole slew of other things, including doing internal brand planning and POA rollouts. We've seen a huge increase in our bolus of business of people have been frantically trying to convert their in-person meetings to virtual ones, and we're very, very happy that we've been able to provide that resource to individuals. So we also believe that everything starts with an idea. Right now, we deal with a lot of brand ideas and brand planning and implications for brands and services. The greater vision at Impetus is that we want to be able to help to positively disrupt healthcare. And certainly there's no better time than the amazing, unfortunate accelerant that COVID-19 has brought, where we've looked at this as really a change accelerant. So because everything starts with a conversation, we want to be the platform in which those courageous conversations can happen. Those big, hairy, audacious goals, those plannings, all the things that seemed like they were science fiction at one point, which are drastically and rapidly coming into fruition today. We're super excited to be the platform or the catalyst for those kinds of transformative discussions. I'm also here as the Toronto chapter lead for the transformative technology community. And here we're looking at raising the well-being and flourishing of over 1 billion people by the year 2030. By literally investigating these types of technologies, ideas, and all sorts of other innovations and bringing these to people across the globe. So with all of that said, this Fireside Chat web series is really the idea behind starting these conversations, speaking with people like the Jons of the world, like the Limbixes of the world, these really innovative, cutting-edge companies, and getting these big ideas and concepts out to the world around us. So I'm very happy and with much pleasure to introduce to you Jon Sockell, who is the technology entrepreneur and co-founder with Limbix. Now, Limbix is a company that provides a digital therapeutic for adolescent mental health. And prior to going to Limbix, Jon ran marketing at Keep Truckin'. And he was the key product marketing and did key product marketing and other verticals such as Medallia. And he was helping to drive each company's valuation to over $1 billion. Jon actually has a BA in economics from Washington University in St. Louis and an MBA from Vanderbilt University. So welcome, Jon. So happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So as you know, many of the people that are around the table, the virtual table today, are part of our technology, our startup ecosystem, people working in the neurotech, the well-being, the flourishing space. And we really wanted to spend today's session diving deeper into the kind of the nooks and crannies behind what Limbix is, how you got started, what it means to be an entrepreneur, and getting your company into the success that it has today. So maybe we can just start off kind of with where things started from you as being kind of like a marketing guru, and how you kind of came to where you are today.
Yeah, so I've always had an interest in startups and entrepreneurship, but it actually wasn't until Limbix that I was a co-founder for the first time. So I had to kind of learn my way through things a bit for a while. After business school, I ended up joining an early mid-stage company called Medallia, and that was a good way for me to learn about the growth cycle. They just raised a Series B from Sekou at the time, and they were scaling up. So it was just a period where, you know, we quickly grew from maybe 100-ish when I joined to 1,000, and that really accelerated a lot of learning. And I think all that was just a byproduct of is finding a top-tier VC and identifying portfolio companies that were hiring. And that was sort of a way for me to initially learn. And then from there, I ended up really falling in love with the marketing side of businesses and telling the stories and trying to get the brands out there and reach audiences around the world. And so after a few years at Medallia, we grew a ton. I then went small again, and I went to a company called Keep Truckin'. Probably never heard of it, but we were about 8 people at the time and 0 revenue. And that's a company now that's 1,500 people and makes hundreds of millions of dollars a year, providing basically, we digitize trucks. And so America had, and actually Canada too, had this mandate that came out a few years ago requiring electronic logging for all long haul trucks. So that was just an opportunity in the market that you could tell was going to, every truck was on paper and offline, 5 years ago. And it really wasn't too hard for me to imagine a world where that would be different. But after those 2 companies, which were, I was an early employee of, I really wanted to find a way to do businesses with a social cause or good for it, basically a tech for good for underserved areas. And we started our business with virtual reality and mental health. And you might be thinking that's a crazy combination of 2 things. And what happened is my 2 co-founders were both working at VR companies. One was Ben. His previous company was acquired by Facebook, and then once he was at Facebook, he moved over to the Oculus team because he wanted to learn about VR. And then our other co-founder, Scott, he was working at Google Daydream, doing building Street View. So a lot of 3D imagery and so a lot of chops around making virtual reality. And so we thought, well, we want to do a social good business. Virtual reality is coming. This is 2016. And obviously the story is very different now and there's no virtual reality. But in 2016, we thought, if VR does becomes like a consumer staple and is out there, it's not going to be a stretch to think that there'll be VR in healthcare. And the reason for that is we'd seen hundreds of peer-reviewed publications show VR as a useful tool within mental health, usually for things like exposure therapy. So you can imagine maybe like someone has PTSD, they go from fighting overseas in a war. If they come back, their therapist might want to expose them to those scary things and help them work on coping techniques. And VR would be a great medium for that. So we started with that, and that was really a miss. And we made a decent product. It's sold around the world, but it really wasn't solving a problem for all the parties in healthcare. And in healthcare, you really have 3 Ps. You got your provider, your patient, and your payer. And when we started that business, we made a great tool for the provider. It was fun for the patient, but the payers didn't care. And so that was a real mistake. And so, since then we've kind of learned a little bit about the types of content that's helpful with the mental health and have pivoted our business pretty significantly. And now what we're building are prescription apps that can be basically software as treatment that a doctor, not a therapist, could prescribe as a treatment for mental health disorders. And we're starting with adolescent depression. And we started with adolescent depression because we had a lot of learnings from adolescent populations with our first generation product. And importantly, there's a really unmet need around the world for providing services for adolescent mental health. Basically, it's an area that, insurance isn't like paying for therapy. There's a shortage of providers in the world. There's still stigma around treatment. And so there was a lot of opportunities, we thought, to kind of really change what we did and take some of the learnings in terms of content, but apply them to mobile devices and build them as prescription products. And what I mean by that is the FDA a few years ago, after we started the company, rolled out some really important guidance. And basically they are now evaluating apps, or they will evaluate apps the same way they do pharmacy drugs by a pharma company. So you can imagine that there's a lot of wellness apps in the world today for mental health, but there aren't any prescription apps that a primary care doctor could give someone who's in trouble. So if you're a pediatrician today, you probably, see lots of patients a day. Maybe now it's over telehealth, unfortunately, but you're probably used to seeing, 10 patients a day. And about anywhere between 1 in 5 to 1 in 8 of them will experience depressive symptoms. And they'll measure that. Oftentimes they'll do a PHQ, a patient health questionnaire, to get the session started. And if they realize that this teenager is experiencing depressive symptoms, they're left with 2 choices today. The first choice is they could prescribe them antidepressants. And antidepressants have a lot of challenges with teenagers, as you can imagine. Worst being that they increase the risk of suicide. And that's exactly what we're trying to make better when we're reducing depressive symptoms. And the second thing that therapist could give is a referral to an actual psychotherapist. And that's usually pretty helpful, but that psychotherapist often has a wait list that's 6 months, 12 months longer than the patient can really wait. And so it's not a great option. It's a great option if there's availability, but for anyone who's on, unless they're private pay out of pocket, or in a country that really values mental health services, it's probably going to be hard for them to get access to that. And so when we made this pivot more recently to build, prescription digital therapeutics, it really was trying to think about how do we improve access to treatments and how do we inject a solution into the care models that already exist. So teenagers are already able to see primary care. Let's get treatment from primary care. And that was sort of one of the big things we learned and we wanted to do and it just made a lot more sense once FDA rolled out all this guidance.
It's amazing. Jon, there's so much there that I want to dig into. So I'm actually going to just take some of these in little bite-sized pieces and linger on them a little bit. So One of the things I did think, and we're not here to talk about keep trucking, but one of the things I think came from that message is that no matter how bizarre or small or weird or convoluted the idea is, there's always a potential market. And I think that the world has kind of turned around recently with COVID. And I know that everybody is targeting healthcare and, in certain areas, but the world has changed. And I think to all the entrepreneurs who are listening here is we're in an unprecedented opportunity, although we all feel like, oh my goodness, there's job losses and the economy's in an upheaval. There's no better time to be an entrepreneur, to be innovative, to take some interesting niches and to turn it on its heels with some creative thinking. And I think that you are a great showcase of that. Yeah. You've also brought up the idea about finding these other founders that you have partnered with. And so I'd like you to be able to share with people. I'm going to just, if I can just kind of dissect each of it, because you have a lot to share, but I'm just going to dissect these in small pieces. Is if you can share with us some, what it takes to collaborate with people, because being in a partnership is like being in a marriage. I mean, it's not always going to be roses and people are going to have their challenges. How did you go about finding your founders? What advice would you give to not only find them, but to sustain them?
Sure. I think there's a lot of great ways to build a founding partnership. And, I think some people, there's advantages to finding new people with that you don't know and that you might be able to have a certain type of professional relationship with. Other folks just tend to go back to the same people that they know. And that was more for me. There's two people that I co-founded this business Limbix with. And the first one was a mentor of mine since 2008. And so, I'd already known him for a long time, Ben, our CEO, and he had two really successful exits and was really wanting to just do a social cause as well. And so that was just, I think we had really aligned interests in that, and that was helpful. And I also felt like I was working with someone I could learn from a lot. And then my other co-founder was my roommate from college, 100 years ago. And we, we were roommates, and he was an engineering major and I was economics. And afterwards, I went down the business side. He went and did a PhD in machine learning. And then eventually we ran into each other when he came back to the Bay Area and was working at Google. And so Ben and Scott and I, we would watch Survivor on Wednesdays, which is like the dorkiest show in the world. And we would talk about this business. And then when the timing was right, when it was the right time for Ben to leave Facebook, for Scott to leave Google, and for me to leave now what was late stage startup Keep Truckin', it was just the right timing. And so we all kind of had a shared, we had aligned interest in terms of wanting to do social cause. And we just had a general interest in some of the types of tech we wanted to build, but it was really more about problems that we wanted to solve in the market.
And I think you also raised something that was also interesting. So it's not only the different ways to find founders. So you're saying that you actually found your co-founders just through relationship and shared values, but I'm assuming that the shared values is what really keeps the sustainability of the relationship and the sustainability and the expansion of your company. You also brought up something interesting around where the company originated.
Yeah.
And that there was some slight pivots that happened. Can you share the story about how it started in the VR,
Yeah.
in the VR AR space, and what parameters in the marketplace caused you to say, hey, it's time to change this. Let's do this differently?
Yeah, so it's really, one of the most important things is to not fight, the tides and the way they're going. So when, I have examples I can point to from previous companies as well, that we just weren't trying to fight the momentum happening in the market, just more let's ride along it. So in late 2016, I'm sitting in Sequoia's office, and we have a little EIR room, and we're stuffed in this tiny little room in the corner, and they've got really fancy snacks in the living room. And then, and so we're in this corner, and we're like, okay, VR is definitely coming, which you can definitely say we're wrong now. And we're thinking, okay, so VR is going to come. We're going to make VR for healthcare, and we're going to find an area in healthcare where it could be most helpful. And we found mental health as an area where we thought it could be really useful. And so we started building that way. Sequoia gave us some seed capital that made it really easy to get started and raise additional capital from there. We put a team together. We moved out of their office a couple months later to an office in Palo Alto just around the corner, and just started hacking away. And so we made a bunch of initial versions of the virtual reality product we wanted to make, which was helping desensitize people to things they were afraid of. And that was sort of it in a nutshell, as a tool that psychologists could use. But then, you have to look at the market, and VR didn't proliferate. You could have gone on Sand Hill Road as an entrepreneur and said VR for anything in 2016, and you probably would have gotten a couple $1 million in as a seed round, which wasn't hard. You just had to say, like, here's a team that can build on it. Here's an area of the market that's going to exist. Well, VR didn't proliferate. They're really flattening out, and if anything, we're seeing some declines. And I don't think people want to be sharing or are going to be able to use VR in the same way, at least in hospitals now, that, in this type of world anyway. So 2 years ago, we realized that this was not going to be a giant business. We had built a solid product with good margins. We probably had 70% margins on each sale. But we didn't think our TAM, our total addressable market, was big enough to keep the venture community interested. We thought we could build this into maybe a $10 million company, but not into a $1 billion company. And ultimately, that just isn't going to keep at least venture capital investors excited. It's a great lifestyle business, and I think that whoever ends up taking over that business from us is going to have a lot of fun. But what we had to look over, what we couldn't overlook 2 years ago, was the realization that FDA is going to evaluate software as a medical, as software as a treatment, as like a pill. And we thought, well, we're making software. It's meant to help people with mental health, but it's only can get so big if we have to sell it through a psychologist, and that psychologist is never going to use VR with every patient, and it's never going to be something critically important to their practice. And so we just couldn't build a big enough business that way. But then when the FDA rolled out this guidance, we realized, well, every pharma company is going to want to build apps that can, be used either as a diagnostic, a treatment, or a preventative tool for helping people with various cases. And right now, there are literally only 3 apps, I think, that have been approved by the FDA so far for prescription. And so basically these apps, they're all by Therapeutics, a company that is not public, but probably has about a $500 million or so valuation now, and has raised a ton of capital. And what they are trying to do is be the pharma company that has the whole pipeline of therapeutics, so that doctors could prescribe as a treatment. And so we thought, well, geez, think about how many drugs there are in the world. Think about how big those markets are. Think about how many people get, all sorts of medicines. Well, of course, there's going to be apps that are prescribed. Like, it's not hard for me to imagine a world where doctors go from recommending apps, which they do today. If you come in stressed out, they might say download Calm or Headspace, going to a spot where we prescribe them for specific diseases. And so that was exciting for us. So what we had to do then is take a look at the market, and we first figured out, well, who's building what and for what type of disorders. And we saw that lots of people were building prescription digital therapeutics, at least very early on. Only a few have been cleared. But most all of them have been adult focused. And we thought, well, that's interesting. That means that this whole section of the market that has lots of mental health issues folks 13 to 18 or even 21 aren't being addressed. And the way that you build a program for a 45-year-old with depression is fundamentally different than the way you build a 15-year-old's depression program. The thing that a 15-year-old's going through is probably bullying and homework and college admissions and standardized tests and all sorts of, sports practices or whatever it is. There's lots of things that can be really stressful at that age. When you're 45, you might be thinking about your mortgage, you might be thinking about your kids, you might be thinking about like totally different things. And so the way you design a program for that is fundamentally different. We have this little kitschy avatar called Limbot, this cute little animated therapist, essentially. It's a robot that is meant to increase the therapeutic alliance. That robot works great with a teenage audience. It does not work well on folks my age. And so I think it's, what we were excited about with this change in the tides with FDA was that ultimately we could build programs for specific diseases that had specific markets. And so we picked depression to start for kids 13 to 18. And then after we build our first, and once we get our first one cleared, we'll then go and continue to build more therapeutics related to depression. So that primary care provider, they see the patient, they come in, instead of referring them out to a wait list, they can hopefully give them another therapeutic. And so, depression's obviously first, but then I think what's comorbid, and what's comorbid would probably be anxiety-based disorders. So things like panic disorder, social anxiety is going to be really big right now with COVID. You're going to have things like eating disorders. And so lots of opportunities in there that we think could be complementary, but really picking a specific market and a specific disease first, trying to nail that and then expand from there. And
and I think that's really good advice, Jon, is that the idea of sometimes you have to go slow to go fast, or sometimes you really need to super or uber focus for you to really take off. And I think that's really, really great advice. So let's actually, dissect that a little bit. So you've decided to pivot. You're now going into this new space and riding the momentum of the groundswell behind a new FDA approval and this whole new bandwagon of opportunity. And so you decided to ride that wave. How did you decide to change the makeup of your team? Who did you start including in that, and what roles were they taking on?
That's a terrific question. Our team looks a lot different now than it did 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago when we started the company. And it's been bittersweet because you form bonds with people that that obviously things change in life. And so when we first started building virtual reality tech, it's like new hard tech. And if any of you guys ever use VR, maybe not. There's a huge spectrum of quality. And some stuff can be nauseating and make you want to vomit. Sometimes it's immersive and beautiful, and you really think you're somewhere else, and it's powerful. So we wanted to be on that side of things, not obviously the nauseating, low quality side of things. And so we had to hire some real strong engineering talent. I mentioned my co-founder, Scott. He had a PhD in machine learning and computer vision from Carnegie Mellon, and was really smart building Street View work, the same product you guys probably all use that I use all the time too. And so that was a really key partner for us to start building this. And then obviously the people who wanted to go work with Scott were really, really high caliber. And so that was important for us. Now, we don't build VR anymore. We're building mobile apps, and there's lots of easy ways to build, mobile apps now. There's even things like React Native or Flutter, which will let you, build on multiple platforms. So you can build on both iOS and Android. You don't need to have an iOS engineer and an Android engineer anymore, like we did, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. 10 years ago, do we have phones? Almost. And then, 10 years, we definitely had phones. And then, so, I think that what that meant is that the engineering challenges were simpler. And so it doesn't mean that we don't need engineers. We need great engineers, but we don't need someone who's on the bleeding edge, that can be really expensive sometimes, to build a mobile app. A lot of us know how to build mobile apps. And so that was, I think, one thing that changed with the team. And then on the engineering side for product, and the other side of it was the kind of clinical expertise that we were pairing with it. So we originally had like a director of psychology because we were making a VR kit for psychologists. Well, we don't do that anymore. And so now what we have, is a chief medical officer, someone with an MD who previously worked at FDA at Digital Health, approving these devices. And instead we're bringing her on. And the type of people that go work with Marissa, our chief medical officer, are PhDs in neuroscience, or and who help run the research studies and run the trials that we take through, that we're hoping to take eventually through FDA through clearance. And so fundamentally, the big difference in our team is that we've gone from like just kind of bleeding edge engineering to instead like clinical people who, really understand healthcare workflows and who understand the regulatory environment and how to like build a quality management system and have auditing and paper trails and everything we do. And so it's been a little different. Like it's a little bit of it's thick to get through some of this stuff. But I also think that's like, as an entrepreneur, that's pretty exciting because that's a barrier to entry. And so like, if you're thinking about a healthcare startup, I'd be really excited by the fact that FDA is evaluating these things and that I'd pick a corner of the market that no one's working on right now. And so a lot of people are looking at chronic diseases. A lot of people are looking at CBT-based, cognitive behavioral therapy-based apps, because there has been some sort of predicate devices that have been, who looked good in the approval process. And so I'd be finding areas that people aren't working on. And I think that they now, with digital health being at the forefront of every investor's mind, I think it's a good time. I think I can tell you personally, 2 months ago, we raised our Series A like 3 days before COVID started. It was like the luckiest timing in the world that the round closed. I mean, literally COVID had already hit California by the time we were in due diligence. I'm telling all the lawyers, just accept. I just let's not negotiate. Let's just get this in. This is about to get dark. And this is like early February. And so we got that done. And then all of a sudden the follow-on capital, which was all lined up for us, ready to go. Usually the easiest part is follow on, the lead's the hard part. That all got real quiet. And then now I would say in the last 3 weeks, I've been getting a lot of emails that say, hey, we're reopening up our funds. We realize digital health is more important than ever. I'd love to tag along that same deal you offered us last time. And so I do think that if you're thinking of starting a company right now, or you're trying to expand, that capital markets could be a little better within digital health right now than they were maybe 2 months ago.
Right, great advice, and definitely starting to see some of that opening with investors, VCs, and I think healthcare, especially the work that you're doing around, can be looked at as stress management, all of the psychological impact that COVID-19 has had. So I'm sure you're probably feeling that that groundswell.
Yeah, I mean, it's really it's a bittersweet thing, because like it pains me to see how much folks are struggling right now, and a lot of people are losing work and missing graduations and missing important milestones. And so I'm really sad about that. On the flip side, I think as an entrepreneur, I'm happy that I'm going to be able to keep my business going, because I think it's the right type of business for this economic climate. And so I think that means there's lots of other opportunities within this as well. So I like what you're saying is encouraging some sort of disruption. Roelof Botha, one of the lead partners at Sequoia, had this really important line where he talked about startups have such an unfair advantage when the world gets disrupted. So that happened back in 08, 09, right? There was an unfair advantage. And then apps became really like, you knew this is where things were going to go. And so you could build almost any app and you're going to build a decent company because you're in the right place at the right time. You're not fighting these tides. And so right now I sort of think like, well, digital health is going to be a growing tide, and you're going to have an unfair advantage over a pharma company that has no idea how to code. And so I think that that's what I look at. And then I'm thinking, if I'm a pharma company, I'd be pretty sad to miss out on another vertical. And so I think we'll see acquisitions in this space as more and more products gets cleared and pharma wants to sell more to healthcare.
So while we're talking about venture back, we're talking about raising funds, especially companies like yourselves. And I'm going to pick apart the idea around clinical trials in a moment, but for right now, let's actually just talk a little bit about giving people advice on how to select your VC, or who are you approaching, and why did you approach Sequoia? Everybody has different reputations around being founder friendly versus not, and all sorts of other things. So what were some of the things that you were looking for, and what advice would you give to people?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there some, you know, I think ultimately you want to think about how your VC is going to be helpful for you. So if you have a decent idea and a decent plan with a good team, there should be multiple investors interested. And so then you really want to be thinking about what is it this investor can do that would help my business. And I don't think it has to be a huge name like for that to be the case. And I'll talk about some investors we've worked with since Sequoia that you may not have heard of that have been super helpful for us. But you know, early on, I think the reason why we worked with Sequoia is, I'm sure you know, a lot of folks know they have a terrific reputation. But I think we also had a relationship with them. I think I mentioned that the first company I worked at was a Sequoia-backed company that IPO'd, and so that was, I don't think it hurt. And and then Ben's my co-founder, he had a 9-figure exit on a company that was backed by Sequoia also. And so that was those were both, I think, you know, some comfort level there. And they were going to be friendly enough to let us work in their office and see some pitches and work on our own pitch plan. And they basically want to see, you know, us succeed again. And so that was something that, you know, just they seem to care about us. And then I think a big thing that I liked in them is they do a lot to educate us. So they had this, you know, they had this program called AMP they once took us through that was 10 weeks that Scott and I went through, that they just basically, you know, once a week we would learn from other entrepreneurs who had done, you know, successful things, or from other partners, and, you know, all sorts of stuff from, you know, how to raise capital to how to manage your board to how to go to market to the types of materials you wanted for that, just all sorts of topics, like a mini MBA, but for entrepreneurship. And that was really helpful. But they're also, you know, when we got our, you know, we had a great article at the cover of Business for the New York Times, and that was because Sequoia reached out to them. And like, so there's lots of things that you can do. So you want to be thinking like, what can you ask your VC to do? And at the end of almost every pitch I've been to, they ask, well, what questions do you have for us? How can we be helpful? And the reason is that like nobody wants to be the dumb money, right? And so if you are, if you can't give that person a reason why you need their capital specifically, then they might be thinking, why do you need my money? Like, because ultimately, like if someone comes to me and asks me for money, my first reaction is, why haven't you asked somebody more successful than me? Why haven't you asked somebody more strategic than me? Why haven't, like, what is in this wrong with your idea? But if someone came to me and said, hey, I'd love you to invest in this company because we're doing digital therapeutics and it's for this specific thing, and I think you have expertise in this area, then that tells me like, oh, okay, well, you know, that actually might be a good fit then. They're not just trying to, you know, fill up around. And so my general advice would be, find someone who can give you honest feedback, that you are comfortable receiving that. Find someone that you can tell them the truth. You know, we had to tell Sequoia that we were going to be pivoting from VR, that they're going to get squeezed out of the cap table a bit for this pivot. We're going to have to do a little bit of a down round. We had to like, that was not fun. But then they're like, okay, well, thanks for telling us. We're going to follow on the next round. And so just being really honest about that, I think was important for us.
That's fantastic. So obviously you're doing the hard thing. Your company is decide, and it's also a very competitively differentiating thing. And that is going down the exciting route of developing a digital therapeutic that could potentially have long-term financial benefits to you, because if it gets incorporated through Medicare, Medicaid, it becomes a prescription,
Yep.
Then suddenly you're looking at public payers. So
right.
Tell us a little bit about, getting started in that place. It seems very arduous. Like you said, it's a barrier to entry. You're now starting to talk about, phase 2, phase 3 clinical studies, the time patients required to do that. Tell us a little bit about the thinking and the journey associated with doing clinical trials.
Absolutely. Yeah. So biggest mistake I think I made in that Sequoia office in 2016 is I'm on the phone with one of the founders of Ginger, and she says, hey, John, make sure you find your payer before you do anything else. And I was thinking, yeah. I'm going to make a great product for the providers and the patients. They're going to love it. And then the payers will figure it out later. And that was a huge mistake. And so this time around, I think, we've had to really prioritize the payer and who's going to ultimately reimburse for this product. And so we really leaned on our venture capitalists to help start that process. And in the most recent Series A we raised, our lead was a company called GSR Ventures. And we chose them because they had a team of MD MBAs. And so that whole team really understood healthcare in and out. They had made multiple healthcare investments before. They had a large fund. And were able to really provide a lot of insightful thinking to us that we had not done before. You know, Ben and I hadn't been in healthcare at all before this, and all of a sudden we were learning a lot of terminology, and we thought this was really great. Like, they're educating us and also, you know, impressed with our phase 1 results. So we were happy about that. And then, so, you know, for now, what we're trying to do is have like when you're taking these prescription digital therapeutics to market, you're gonna have 2 paths. One path is gonna be your clinical path, and you're gonna be really measuring efficacy, and you wanna show this thing works, and that's really your providers and your patients. But then the other side is gonna be the health economic outcomes research you wanna run. And so that's where you're gonna wanna find, you know, if you know insurance companies, then, you know, obviously you can take advantage of that, but hopefully you have an investor you can go lean on that can help you with some of those early introductions to basically find a health system and a payer who can run a study where we show some sort of reduction in costs for the insurer or something to that effect. And so basically, you know, for at least for Limbix Spark, for teens with depression, you know, we're trying to show either some sort of savings on therapy sessions, savings on ER visits, you know, or something to that effect. And so there's a few ways that we'll look at this. And so in parallel, while going down the efficacy path, we're also going to have to prove that there is an ROI there. And so when GSR made that investment in us, they basically said, look, we think that there's a commercialization risk that we're a little uncomfortable with, but we think that companies like Pear Therapeutics and others who are, you know, $500 million companies, they're going to have to figure out commercialization now. So why don't you guys plan on copying what they do, and in the meantime continue to do product development as you take your things through on the efficacy path or down your clinical path. And so that's what we're doing. And then in parallel, we will be running a couple of health economic studies later this year or early next year, most likely. And then, so we'll be doing these things in parallel. We want to have that buy-in. And then long-term goal, we're going to have to do state-by-state Medicaid, you know, reimbursements, because I think that this is really the market we want to serve. And this is where digital therapeutics, I think, can be powerful, is that you want to go to those communities that don't have access. And then all of a sudden there's a compelling reason to provide a treatment for them. It's low cost, and, you know, and it can be obviously scaled since it's software. So, you know, as an entrepreneur, you'll be fine as a business if you get that integrated.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of things going on simultaneous. And the other thing that we hear a lot in this space about is the importance of real world evidence. You hear this a lot in pharma clinical studies,
Yes.
and they're really challenged to come up, especially after COVID-19. A lot of traditional pharma clinical studies were halted because their clinical endpoints were not resilient enough, meaning that they didn't give patients the option of, you know, investigation in any location that they would prefer. They had to come in, or they had to be analyzed by a CRO. Tell us a little bit about the advantage of the digital therapeutic as it relates to resilient endpoints and sort of real world evidence as inputted directly by patients themselves.
Yeah, so real world evidence is great, right? Because when you run a trial, you know, at these various sites, there's things that can prop up, you know, how people are engaging with the app or how much they are getting efficacy out of it. But ultimately, you really want to know that this stuff works in the wild. And one of the things that's happened since COVID is that the FDA rolled out some guidance where they are now letting people test their products before clearance. We are actually not going to go do that, but we're going to do with a slight little spin on that. So we're seeing Pear and Akili are going to go do that. We're also going to do a real world evidence trial, but we're not, instead of like, but that'll actually be as a trial. So FDA is saying you can put out your prescription digital therapeutic as a wellness app right now and take data from that and bring it to them. We actually think there's like pros and cons to that. One of the pros is that you get some branding elements. I think one of the cons is, though, you're going to have really messy data, and it's not necessarily going to be specific for these types of the user groups that you're going after. So that means when you have that data to go to FDA down the road, it won't be as compelling to them. So following the guidance of our CMO, who, you know, used to do the digital health lead at FDA, her advice was, why don't instead we do a real world evidence trial without any sites? And so a siteless trial is just such a smart thing to do right now. Basically, if you can go create an app and get your IRB to approve it, and run a real world evidence trial where you do it all digitally. We do the e-consent over video chat, all that stuff. If you can do that, it's an incredibly powerful service. And there's a couple reasons for that. Like, so first is that when we go into our pivotal trial next year with FDA, and it will be at 15 sites around the world, we will be really, really scared, right? We're going to spend well over $1 million, probably closer to 2, to run that trial. And I really would love to know that it's going to be approved before I spend all that money, right? And so getting real world evidence is going to give us a lot of confidence. We're going to be able to really kind of do some testing and try to figure out the true active ingredients in Spark that are helping teens get better. And so I think that if you can do that, that's like the first reason to do it. It'll de-risk your trials. But the second reason is that there's a business development reason to do it. And so, I was mentioning that, Limbix is focused on a niche of the market that many of the larger digital therapeutic companies aren't going after. Well, once they realize that we're going after that, we've been getting emails or phone calls or meetings from folks that say, hey, how would you like to partner? And we would love to be able to go after this, segment of the market. Or maybe what we'd like to do is take your depression protocol and try it on a different population that you're not going after. And so now what that means is that if we have an ability to run real world evidence trials, we can actually test these products that we may want to not, go after markets, but that other people in the space do want to go after, and increase their value. Because what we can do is we can take that protocol for depression that works for where we're going after teenagers, try it on someone who's 30 or 45 or older, and if it works for that person too, we can now license that out to that other company. So these real world evidence trials, I think, are great for de-risking your own FDA pathway, as well as just making deals.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Love it. And it's definitely a wave to ride for sure. We talked a little bit about the VCs, the other sorts of, ways of raising funds and helping you sail through this difficult period when you're trying to get the evidence for the efficacy, et cetera, before you can get into the payer system. Tell us a little bit about potential partnerships like pharma companies. As you know, pharma runs into issues with loss of exclusivity, reaching the end of patent life, looking at investigating ways of expanding beyond the pill and having some of that pressure of, competing with consumer electronic companies, competing against the big five, everybody is heralding into the healthcare space. Tell us a little bit about some of the strategic thinking that you're seeing there.
Yeah. So we'll talk about a couple of things here. So for pharma partners, I think one thing that we're seeing is taking advantage of international pharma. And so if we take a look at a company like Akili is making a video game for treating ADHD as an alternative to Adderall. I believe is Adderall. And so what they are also going to this FDA path. They are a little closer to clearance than Limbix is. And right before, so they should get cleared any minute. But right before even before getting clearance, they were able to make a deal with, I believe it was Shionogi, and which is a pharma company in Japan. And Shionogi, I think it was Shionogi. They paid $20 million to Akili, non-dilutive funding, for exclusive rights to sell that ADHD product once it's FDA cleared. And I was blown away by that. And so that's a lot of money, and that's non-dilutive money too. And so it's not to be scoffed at. And so I think that I think one thing we're seeing is digital therapeutic companies are finding specific markets that want access to these types of tools and then trying to make partnerships with them. Other cases, they're just joining their cap table and co-developing things with influence. Or in this case, that was really exciting for Akili. For Limbix, we recently brought a Korean pharmaceutical company onto our cap table that's building a digital therapeutic for OCD. And so that was strategic for us because we weren't really going to build OCD, but it is tangentially related to depression, anxiety, and some of the areas that we were most interested in. They don't know what they are. They don't have the same software expertise that we do. And so they're getting some benefit by learning from the way we develop products. And we're getting some benefit by being able to reach a market that I never would have been able to otherwise. And so I think that one trend is with pharma is we're seeing some overseas partnerships where specific countries, like I'm seeing Japan and Korea, and some Asian companies are a little more excited for a digital therapeutic than maybe other regions. Okay, so that's one. The second thing is we got to figure out though what pharma companies have a sales model that can be effective. So Novartis had a famous breakup with Pear last year, and so Pear had originally made a partnership with them to sell or distribute Reset and Reset O. Reset and Reset O are the first two therapeutics that were FDA cleared by Pear, and they're for addiction-related treatments. And so the team. Our understanding is that the team at the pharma team didn't really have the right skill set to sell digital therapeutics. They don't know how to do that. And so, you think you're gonna have to find two things. You're gonna have to find one, a pharma company who's interested in rights to your product in their country, if you're looking overseas or at least in your disease area. And then second, who you also think has a sales model for actually distributing it. And so then if they don't, which I think many of them don't because they've never sold these before, you then want to think about negotiating revenue guarantees, where basically like, if you're going to take exclusive rights to my product for a few years, then I need to know that I'm getting this much money this year, double that next year, and double that again the year after, because who knows, they could just sit on that and park it. And so that's one of the things that we're a little worried about. Because pharma makes a lot of money, and if I were them, they would probably just want to shut down everything that's new and just keep that cash flowing.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. So lots of different opportunities, ways of partnering, ways of raising funds, ways of looking at revenue streams. I think in the future is a lot of people are investigating this opportunity around the digital pharmacy and the digital therapeutic. So with all of that said, what do you surmise this digital pharmacy is going to look like? And who do you think is going to be brave enough to start building this? Because right now, nothing really exists. So what is your anticipation or view on what the digital pharmacy is going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way it's going to look for the patient's perspective is that, and a little bit of the prior perspective, is that there'll be these digital therapeutics will be listed on the formulary in the electronic medical record. And so there are some companies that are trying, to work on that right now. And so when the doctor, they see the patient, they click a button in the EMR that says, give them the digital therapeutic or whatever it is. And then that patient gets pinged to download the app. And they also get a unique code in that process. So that is tied, because not anyone can download these apps. These aren't wellness apps. These are ones that have to be specifically prescribed by a physician. And so I think that what we're going to see is more digital formularies where people are trying to list their apps in the digital formulary. You're going to have people who are going to try to bubble up and be, the platform of all the digital companies. And I think that's what Pear wants to win at. Pear's got 3 cleared products. I just heard, before I did this call, I was on McKinsey's doing their healthcare digital conference today also. I was listening to Corey, the CEO of Pear, just literally half an hour before this. And he's talking about there's tens of other therapeutics in their pipeline that they're ready to go. And, I know they're trying to acquire other therapeutic companies. And I think that their whole goal is to be the one-stop shop for all these digital therapeutics. I think that's going to mostly be as a pharmacy benefit is how it's probably going to be more likely, the successful business model over time. But I think that workflow is going to be the doctors in their EMR. There's a digital formulary. They click a button, and then the patient is prompted with a unique code to use the app.
What I think is really competitively differentiating, to be honest with you, in 2023, the FDA is releasing a Drug Supply Chain Security Act. Well, actually, it's coming out in November and being enforced in 2023. And what's really interesting is it's to counteract counterfeit or drugs that are outside of the flow. And what's really interesting about about digital therapeutics and potentially getting included eventually in the blockchain of things is it's probably a lot easier to track it. So this is something to potentially include in your future marketing differentiating comments.
Yeah.
So
you're right.
You can add me into your advisory group.
Thank you.
Tons of pharma experience. So we have a couple of minutes left. If anybody has any questions, please type those away in the chat line. Otherwise, I'm going to continue to ask Jon because I have never any questions. But lots of opportunity around competition and competitive differentiation. But what is your plan of action in terms of customer acquisition? We obviously have the wellness apps and everybody's downloading out of choice, and you probably have a nice little business going on there. But what is going to be the plan of action? Do you have like a whole marketing schema? Are you going to be riding alongside one of your pharma partners to help you do that? Is there going to be legs and lungs in this? What is the plan to start acquiring? Are you going to completely just, focus on physicians and hope that they start clicking that button on their electronic health record?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, we're going to have to do things like get involved with the physician groups, like the American Academy of Pediatrics or other places like that, to try to, do some marketing to them. But it's going to be like a pharma drug where you're going to be marketing to consumers to pull from their doctors. I'm sure you guys have all seen like a Cialis commercial or something. And like, I don't know if that's what we're going to really do, or a Prozac commercial or whatever it is. But I think that, so we'll do some of that. But we're also going to really rely, I think, on the pharma partners longer term. Or I think that, there will be people who, I don't know if we're going to really be the team that builds the sales engine for that. I think ultimately we're going to have to find a partner for that. But I think that the marketing is going to have to go to both the patient and the provider. And then you're going to do a lot of biz dev with insurance. So right now we actually don't do much marketing. So we'll do a little bit of marketing for our real world evidence trial to make sure we get enough participants in there. But for the most part, we do a lot more biz dev and trying to spend time with the folks who will eventually be reimbursing for this or distributing this. We might need to find, a partnership through a digital formulary or some other, so we can list it that way. So we'll have to do a bunch of different things in that sense. There'll be some standard kind of conferences that we go to, and then we'll try to make sure that our stuff's published in great journals. And so hopefully have really robust studies. And then that, hopefully we can get these things picked up in like JAMA or whatever down the road. But that's really interesting one, I guess. That'll be fun.
Yeah, and I have a quick question here before we close up here from Thomas de Bruin, actually.
Yeah, I see it right now, actually.
One of the consultants from Deloitte in Europe, and he's wondering about anything about wearables, biofeedback, other options around connecting for source of data.
I think it depends on, so I think that that's going to be really exciting. There's, obviously Apple Watches have made a lot of progress through the regulatory environment. And I think that we're going to see, things like heart rate variability and galvanic skin response potentially down the road, or other types of biomechanisms that could be interesting. Now, for starting the business though, I have to sort of think like, how does that help? And I don't know, it sort of depends on what the workflow is for where your device is going to be injected. So if I was making a digital therapeutic and I needed to see biofeedback to diagnose somebody, then maybe that's where I'd be using it. Now, as a treatment, maybe there is a tool that dynamically treats you in some way based on biofeedback, and that would be also interesting. For Limbix, we're not looking into biofeedback, and the reason for that is that the way the vast majority of our customers get, which in this case, the patient and the pediatrician, they will get diagnosed, is not through anything through biofeedback. And so we could make maybe Spark a better product, right? Where we could maybe based on how, your heart rate is changing or something, we serve up certain types of content, but it's a bit of scope creep. And ultimately, that pediatrician makes a diagnosis without any biofeedback. And then the treatment itself, most of that's going to be dynamic based on the inputs that the patient puts in through the phone. I think biofeedback can make it better, but I also think that would really slow down our approval pathway and will give time for another company to get to the market first. And so the advice from our VCs was, they also asked like, hey, you could even incorporate VR or biofeedback or both. And ultimately, though, their thought and our thought, we agreed, was that, there's going to be a huge advantage to being first to market. And, a lot of people are going to market for adults, and we just want to be first to market for kids. And if we're first to market for kids, we can layer on a second version of that product where we incorporate biofeedback. And so I think ultimately you'll hack around with it, but you'll just end up wasting time.
Beautiful. Love it.
That's what I worry about.
Well, you know what? This has been an amazing conversation. It's probably everybody who's attending or going to be listening to this afterwards. We could probably keep speaking about it. It's an extremely exciting and extremely awesome space. I'm so stoked about the work that pioneers like yourself are building into the digital therapeutic space. I'll be the first one hanging out there at the digital pharmacy whenever it comes around. I love it. I love the idea. Wouldn't mind probably at some point in the future after your clinical studies are finished to see how you're faring, and would love to actually see how your company is doing. So thank you so much for this, Jon. Just for those who are a reminder, again, this is the kinds of things that we love doing at Impetus Digital and also through TransTech community, is having these courageous conversations, because the way that we're all going to be positively disrupting healthcare is by heralding these conversations, discussing these provocative new therapeutics, ideas, innovations. Everything starts with a thought and with conversations with people like Jon. So if you're trying to solve the world's problems, now that we're living in the new normal with COVID-19, let's get together in platforms like the Impetus Insight platform and other sorts of tools so that we can actually build and sustain these conversations, these dialogues, these collaborations and partnerships, so that we together can really start to embed flourishing and well-being by the year 2030. So thank you again, Jon, for this. For anybody who wants to get in touch with Jon, we will be leaving a link to his LinkedIn profile and to his company website in the show notes to this. Thank you, Jon, so much for your time. You've been awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks to the audience as well. And we will speak with all of you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.